For those of you who were not here yesterday, this is our Spiritual Life Week. It's one of the most important weeks of our semester, our year. And since many of you are on a Wednesday-Friday schedule, let me introduce our speaker again for his second message. And I would encourage you to go online when his first one is posted and catch up because it was terrific. Dr. Gary Brandenburg grew up in California and attended Oklahoma State University on a baseball scholarship. And after receiving most valuable honors, he was drafted by the Baltimore Orioles and played 3 seasons of pro baseball. He went on to receive his Master of Divinity degree at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School and his Doctor of Ministry degree from Gordon Conwell. And after a brief assignment as a youth pastor, he became a church planter in California for 8 years, and then senior pastor of the Grace Community Church in Tyler, Texas for 14 years. Then he, since 2004, has been the lead pastor of the Fellowship Bible Church of Dallas. He recently has transitioned in his role to be co-lead pastor as he passes that baton to the next generation, and it gives him time to devote more time to training and mentoring the next generation of church leaders, and that's why we want him here. He serves as a board member for Mercy Ships. He's spoken all over the world in pastors' conferences and to pursue his deep heart's desire, which is to influence the influencers. He also served on the board of directors of Pine Cove Christian Camp. Some of you attended or worked there. He has been married to his wife, Janice, since 1977. They have 3 children and 5 grandchildren. Yesterday was a wonderful beginning to our week. He's speaking a series out of 2 Timothy chapter 2. Gary, thank you for carving time out of your life and ministry to be a part of us this week. Would you join me in welcoming again Dr. Gary Brandenburg?
Good morning. Vinnie was my neighbor. Vinnie was a mess. Vinnie had wild hair. He was a high school kid, and he was always in trouble. He grew up next door to me. We were planting a church in the Bay Area of California, and his mom, like all single moms, she worked really hard, and she didn't know what to do with Vinnie. So I decided to take Vinnie under my wing. He was a runner. At that time, I was a runner. Now I'm a mall walker, but I would run with Vinnie, and I loved meeting with guys and running with them because the way it worked was I couldn't keep up cardiovascular-wise, so I would just ask them questions because I couldn't breathe well enough to talk, so I just let them talk. And I would run with Vinnie and just kind of keep track of what was going on in his life. One day, just surprisingly, some of you, if you're from the West Coast, you leave your front door open and close the screen door, and all of a sudden there was a knock on the screen door. Gary! And I came running to the front door, and it was Vinnie, and he had this big smile on his face. And he said, "Gary, guess what I just did?" And I thought, man, I could go all over the place with that question. I said, "What did you do, Vinnie?" He said, "I joined the Marine Corps." I thought, I didn't say it because I have such respect for the Marine Corps, but I did ask him the question that apparently is the first time he'd ever thought of this particular question. I said, "Why did you join the Marine Corps?" And he got this like puzzled expression on his face because I don't think he'd thought about that. This is his exact answer. He said, I guess I just got tired of my mom always telling me what to do. You'll be proud of me. I resisted the temptation to say, "You're about to get some mothers that'll make your mother look like Mother Teresa." But I'm proud to say he became a good Marine. And several months later, I saw him, and he was a different person. He was cut. He got one of those free military haircuts. He was a man. And I asked him, I said, "Vinnie, so how was it?" And he just looked at me and he didn't even hesitate. He said, "Man, it was hard." Ministry is hard. Yesterday we looked at the mandate there in 2 Timothy 2:2, that we are to serve others in a way that ensures that the faith is passed from one generation to the next. We're cathedral builders. We're all building a cathedral. And then we looked at the means to ministry. Verse 1, Timothy, be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus. What the Apostle Paul does now, he turns to three metaphors to get across to Timothy the mindset of ministry. He uses the soldier and the athlete and the farmer. And these three occupations appear to have provided great motivation for Paul in his own ministry. You find in other places where he uses this kind of imagery. And if you know, and all of us have heard Paul's epitaph, which comes in those moving words at the very end of his letter, when he says, "I have fought the good fight." That's a soldier. "I've finished the course." That's an athlete. "I have kept the faith." I've cultivated it. I've cared for it. That's the farmer. So Paul reminds Timothy, and through Timothy, he reminds us that ministry is a war to be won, it's a race to be run, and it's a job to be done. And so today we're going to look at this idea of the soldier in verses 3 and 4. He says in verse 3, share in suffering as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. Another translation, endure hardship with me. He uses that little prefix soon. Endure hardship with me as a good soldier of Christ Jesus. No soldier gets entangled in civilian pursuits, since his aim is to please the one who enlisted him. See, I think I know what happened to Vinnie. I really do. I think somebody sold Vinnie on the idea. He thought it would be really cool to go play with guns. Maybe he'd get to ride in a tank. Maybe somebody told him that the Marines were always deployed with the Navy and they go to exotic ports, see the world. As my friend says that spent a lot of years in the Navy, he says, I joined the Navy to see the world, and I spent the whole time in San Diego. He may have even heard that the military would pay for his education, but my guess is that nobody ever sat him down and said, and oh, by the way, you could die. So the first part of this message is going to be hard because in ministry, you could die. And a good soldier endures hardship, and ministry is a good place to find it. I was shocked by a statistic I saw recently, and you always wonder how they come up with these statistics. I don't know how accurate it is, but even if it's close, it's disturbing. 1 out of 10 individuals who enter vocational ministry will actually retire in a ministry role. 1 out of 10. 70% of pastors constantly fight depression. 50% of pastors feel so discouraged they would leave the ministry if they could, but they have no other way of making a living. 80% believe pastoral ministry has negatively affected their families. 80% of spouses feel the pastor is overworked and feel left out and underappreciated by church members. 70% do not have someone they consider a close friend, and 40% report serious conflict with a parishioner at least once a month. Aren't you glad I came? It's hard. And why wouldn't it be hard? There's an unseen war going on for the souls of men and women being taken captive by an unseen enemy. And all of that unseen stuff ultimately erupts in physical manifestations when we see broken families and financial chaos and substance abuse and sexual confusion. And they are just visible societal reminders to us of this invisible war. And so Paul says, Timothy, I want you to pursue ministry with the mentality of a soldier. And in this unjust world, no good deed goes unpunished, and you will be attacked, and ministry is a call to arms. So we follow the old Latin proverb, forewarned is forearmed. Paul fought the good fight on two fronts. You will too. The battle from within, the battle from without. By that I mean, he did battle with both woodpeckers and termites. The woodpeckers are those outside the church. Termites are those inside the church. We're sort of prepared to be attacked by the woodpeckers, the enemies of Christ, those unnamed people that we like to throw into big chunks like secular humanists, whatever that is. But the more painful part of ministry are the people inside the church that will come after you. Those are the termites. You don't even know what's going on until eventually stuff starts falling apart. I told you yesterday, maybe it was in the Q&A time, the man in my church that decided that I was not the right pastor for that church. I planted the church, but he had a better idea. And eventually that church no longer exists. And I have to own my part of that. It was poor leadership on my part. I was a young pastor. I was 33 at the time. But that was a very, very painful part of my life. And I'm no exception in this. I was fired. He was able to bring about a group of people that fired me. I'd never been fired from anything. And one of the things that I had to learn was just because you like people doesn't require them to like you. See, I think there's kind of a personality profile among a lot of ministry-minded people. We like people. And if we like people, then surely they'll like us. And then you run into those people that they're just not going to like you. And so I got fired, and then I discovered that nearly 20%, this is a recent statistic, nearly 20% of leading evangelical pastors have been forced out of a paid ministry role at some point in their lives. It's a hard life. But Paul's understanding of suffering has always been interesting to me. In fact, the whole New Testament concept of suffering has always interested me. Paul's understanding of suffering is that it is ordained by God and just as much a part of the Christian experience as faith. In fact, he says to the Philippians in chapter 1, verse 29 of Philippians, he says, "For it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake." It has been granted to you that you should suffer for his sake. Engaged in the same conflict you saw I had, and now hear that I still have. Now, clearly, he's not talking about self-inflicted suffering. There's no doubt in my mind. An awful lot of suffering, including my own suffering, has been self-inflicted. But the Philippians were suffering because they had aligned themselves with a new religion that was offensive to the surrounding culture. And I would say to you that some of your most intense battles in ministry, even with those inside the church, will be with those who are so cozy with the culture that they are either ignorant or actually oppose biblical values. Be prepared for that. I had a couple leave our church. We followed up because I liked them. And when asked why they were leaving, they said, "Well, we've just never figured out where you stand politically." Sometimes you sound like a Democrat, sometimes you sound like a Republican. And I said, thank you, Jesus. But it's true these days. People come to your church and they're trying to figure out where to put you on that political spectrum as they're listening to you. Another man left our church not long ago. By the way, this doesn't happen all the time. Actually, it does. I lie. But this man was really upset because in a message that I was giving about sanctification and about the use of our bodies, I pointed out that I don't even know how I said it. It wasn't exactly the point of my whole message, but he understood me to say that I was opposed to premarital sex. And he said, you're not going to have any millennials coming to this church. And it got into quite a little testy conversation. And he looks, and you'll see this a lot. You've already experienced it, no doubt. Some people look at the scriptures sort of like it's a living document, like people talk about the Constitution. We've got to change it to come up to speed with our culture. And it's tough to hold the line on that as the culture gets crazier and crazier. So what's encouraging to me, even though it's a dark subject, but the New Testament presents suffering as if it were a sacrament or a means of grace. It's fascinating to me. Listen to Peter's words. I think we've got this on the screen. He says, servants, be submissive to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and gentle, but also to those who are unreasonable. Notice this. For this finds favor. Literally, this is grace, or this grace is for the sake of conscience toward God. A person bears up under sorrows when suffering unjustly. For this is a means of grace if you bear up under suffering unjustly. For what credit is there if when you sin and are harshly treated, you endure it with patience? But if when you do what is right and suffer for it, you patiently endure it, this finds favor with God. And then these words that just about blow you away. For you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example to follow in his steps, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. And while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. Wrongful suffering patiently endured is so remarkable that it becomes a powerful form of witness to an unbelieving world. We've been called to follow Christ's example. When we endure hardship and remain faithful in spite of suffering, we build a credible testimony. Coming to Dallas, I spent about 5 or 6 very, very difficult years, but endured those difficult years, understanding where they were coming from. Some of it was just the nature of transitions. Some of it was just other stuff. But enduring that transition, knowing that on the other side, if I could make it to the other side, that I would build a credible testimony. I remember we got to such a difficult period of time at one point. I said to my elders in the room, I said, men, I'm going to ask this of you. I'm committed to stay here until we get through this wilderness. But I need you to be brutally honest with me. And when we get to the other side of this wilderness, you have to tell me if I still have the moral authority to lead this church. And you've got to be honest with me and tell me that. And thankfully, those guys are the heroes of the story of our church, because they stayed faithful and they stayed committed to Christ all the way through it, and we've entered into some really good times. Churches have seasons. There's good seasons, there's rough seasons. We'll talk about that Friday. I gained a new appreciation of the positive impact of this kind of process one time when I was in the Sequoia National Forest. Some of you know sequoia trees. I think they're related to the redwood trees, but they're amazing, the largest living things on the planet. And I was up in the Sequoia National Forest, and while I was walking among these giants, I remember seeing some guys standing over, and they were raking the forest, which seemed odd to me. I mean, it seemed like good job security, but why are you raking the forest? And so I kept, that bothered me, and I saw a park ranger, and I just thought, I'm going to just ask him. And why are these guys raking the forest? He says, well, that's a good question. I said, oh, good, I'm relieved. I thought it was a dumb question. And you know, they say when you go to seminary, there are no dumb questions. I don't think that's true, but they're just being nice to you, because I've asked plenty of them. But I asked him that question. He said, well, that's he says, a good question. He said, because here's the way sequoias work, redwood trees too. The reason the redwoods are disappearing from California, because they thrive in fire. God equipped them with a nearly fire-resistant bark. And what happens is that they're huge, they're massive. Because of their size, they have a very shallow root system, but it has to go way out into the forest. And what happens is they can't stand competition. So when smaller trees and different species start to volunteer and start taking away the nutrients out of the soil, the redwoods and sequoias start to diminish. But God has an amazing way of eliminating the competition. Spontaneous forest fire burns away all the undergrowth. You go see some of those massive trees that are a couple hundred years old and they scarred, they got black spots because they've been through forest fires. And then somewhere, I don't know, the 1930s or something, we all decided that fire was bad. And we invented Smokey the Bear. And we had everybody putting out forest fires. Guess what? They began to notice that the redwood trees were disappearing. And they hadn't thought about the impact. Every time there was a fire, they put it out. And the trees began to disappear until they began to realize, no, we need to eliminate the competition. That's why they're raking the forest. That's what helps you to understand things like count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that comes your way, as though some strange thing were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. No, it's a hard life. And Paul's pointing this out to Timothy, because Timothy wants out. If I understand chapter 1, verse 3 correctly, Timothy had requested a transfer. He was in Ephesus. He was overwhelmed and overmatched. And Paul says, no, you stay right there. And I want you to have the mindset of a soldier, because being a soldier is a hard life. But notice, Paul goes on to talk about something else. There's a second behavior in that verse, in verse 4, actually. No soldier gets entangled in civilian pursuits. So a good soldier endures hardship, but a good soldier also avoids excessive entanglements. A soldier's life is a focused life. Nobody joins the military, I don't think, and says, look, I got a few requests. I mean, I kind of like my hair this way. I don't want that haircut. I don't look good in green or brown, so wear something. And just, I'll get up when I get up. It's a focused life. And I would say that one of the greatest resources in ministry is to develop a strong no muscle. Learn to say it with me, no. If you've got a 3-year-old, you don't want to teach them that, but I tell you, it's always, and it's just such a great reminder to me. You know this passage, Mark chapter 1, verse 35. And rising very early in the morning while it was still dark, Jesus departed, went out to a desolate place, and there he prayed, and Simon and those who were with him searched for him. And they found him and said to him, this is why I'm not in student ministry anymore. They're going to look for you and find you. And they said to him those words that so many in ministry want so badly to hear. Everyone is looking for you. And Jesus said to them, if I may paraphrase, no. Is that amazing? Guys, just think about this for a minute. What was he doing the day before? Why are they looking for him? He's been healing people. And the next morning, there's already a line. I mean, they're lined up there. And listen, we know who was in Capernaum. There were people like that woman with the issue of blood. She'd been bleeding for 12 years. She'd used up all of her savings and nobody could fix her. There were no doubt a parent in there like Jairus who had a daughter who was dying, 12-year-old daughter. And these are people with legitimate needs. They say, wait a second, but isn't Jesus, doesn't he have compassion on people? Why doesn't he go back and heal these people? It's a legitimate question. But he tells us why right there in the passage. Let us go on to the next towns that I may preach there also. Don't miss this phrase. For that is why I came out. He understood what his mission was. And when you understand what your mission is, you can say no to others. Now, how did he get that? How did he understand what his mission was? Well, it tells us also in the passage. The very first part of the passage, rising very early in the morning while it was still dark, he departed and went out to a desolate place. And there he prayed. If you could learn one thing, if you could master one thing while you're at Dallas Seminary, what would it be? Would it be, I'd like to master Greek. I can remember, seriously, I do remember this. I had to take suicide Greek. I had no experience in Greek, so they had a suicide Greek class in the summer where you caught up to speed. And I remember sitting against the wall in an empty apartment because our furniture hadn't even come yet, and sitting against the wall and praying for the gift of tongues, specifically Greek. And when I got to Hebrew, I didn't even ask. But if you could master one thing while you're in seminary, would it be ecclesiology, eschatology, church history? You go through your mind, you think of the things you might want to master. How about having, set your sights higher. What if they offered a course on casting out demons? Or healing the sick? How about this? A course on raising the dead. Now, the disciples had a front row seat to the miraculous. But let me ask you this question. It's not a difficult question. There's only one place where I see the disciples ever asked Jesus to teach them something. And they said to him, Lord, teach us to pray. And he did. Teach us to pray. I think that's why Peter, when in 4:7, 1 Peter, he says, the end of all things is near. By the way, that's just as true now as it was then. It's not talking about the coming of Christ as immediate. It's talking about the coming of Christ as imminent. In other words, everything that was part of God's redemptive plan has all taken place. From creation up to the resurrection, the Spirit coming, Pentecost, the church. Nothing left to be done except the return of Christ. Peter says, the end is near. Notice what he says in light of that. He says, The end of all things is near. Therefore, be of sound judgment and sober spirit for the purpose of prayer. It's interesting how he does that, because nothing really sharpens your perspective on life than death. I've been meeting with a guy that I've really become fond of, because he told me, in fact, his wife is a Dallas Seminary student. And she told me that she was really concerned for her husband because he was a cynic and a skeptic and wasn't interested in church. And I said, where does he work? And so I went to his workplace and I cultivated a relationship with him. And eventually I taught a 6-week series to a bunch of men, 3 of whom were not even followers of Christ and admitted they were not. And I said, could you help me? I need somebody that's not part of the church to listen to what I'm going to teach, and I want your opinion on it. And they gladly gave it. And when I got done with that 6 weeks, this one man said to me, so that's it, huh? I said, well, I didn't want to presume on, he said, well, can we keep going? I met with him for a solid year. We went all the way through the Gospel of Mark. Still not a believer. And then he got diagnosed with cancer. And he called me. And together in his hospital room, he gave his life to Christ. But now the doctors say after these last couple of years, you've got probably 3 to 6 months left. And it was interesting what he told me not long ago. He said, when I thought I was going to die originally, I didn't get all uptight about all this political stuff and all the stuff going on in the world. It didn't even bother me. He said, but then they did chemo and the tumor started to shrink. And he said, it was really interesting. As the tumor started to shrink, I started getting caught up in all that stuff again. Nothing sharpens your perspective on life like death. And so Peter says, be sober with respect for the purpose of prayer. What is sober? If you explain sober to a child, what would you say? It means not being drunk, not being intoxicated. And I just want to warn you about some of the intoxicants in ministry. Now look, there's a lot of things that we can be intoxicated by. You know that. We can be intoxicated by some of the same things that people in this world are intoxicated by, whether it's pornography or material things or television or music or whatever. But I think there are some unique to ministry. These are fatal attractions. One is the myth of omnicompetence. Get over it. You're not. And I think sometimes driven by the desire for approval, I've tried to make everybody happy. So if the question was ministry, the answer was yes. And here's what I've learned. You are only indispensable until you say no. It's amazing how they'll find someone else. I remember a friend of mine called me one time, and he said, "Hey Gary, I'm really in a pinch." He said, "We've got this men's retreat coming up." He said, "I've called everybody and they're not available. Is there any way you could do it?" Well, I'm flattered. I'm flattered you've called everybody else and they can't. Now it's down to me. But sometimes, that's one of the challenges of ministry is the myth of I have to be good at everything. Another fatal attraction is the respect of the guild. Be careful with that. Because you're going to be around people like you. You'll be in counseling conferences or you'll be at pastors' conferences or you'll be in those sorts of things. And that's where we all kind of measure each other up. And I love what C.S. Lewis said about this. He calls it the lure of the inner ring. My main purpose in this address, he says, is simply to convince you that this desire to be part of the inner ring is one of the great permanent mainsprings of human action. It's one of the factors which go to make up the world as we know it, this whole pell-mell of struggle, competition, confusion, graft, disappointment, and advertisement. And unless you take measures to prevent it, this desire is going to be one of the chief motives of your life from the first day on on which you enter your profession until the day when you are too old to care. Of all passions, the passion for the inner ring is most skillful in making a man who is not yet a very bad man do very bad things. Once the first novelty is worn off, the members of this circle will be no more interesting than your old friends. Why shouldn't they be? You were not looking for virtue or kindness or loyalty or humor or learning or wit or any of the things that can be really enjoyed. You merely wanted to be in, and that is a pleasure that cannot last. Guard yourself against the respect of the guild. Guard yourself against the respect of the world. Don't try to be the coolest church in town. You'll leave Dallas Seminary and you'll know the motto. Preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season. Reprove, rebuke, exhort with complete patience and teaching. And above all, be cool. That's not in the motto. And beware of that passage in John 12. It's one of the saddest passages in all of Scripture, where John says, there were some who walked with Jesus no more, for they loved the approval of men more than the approval of God. Just one more that is, I think, unique to what we do, and that's the myth of greener grass. There's always a better church. There's always a better situation. I once got on a John Steinbeck kick, and I was reading Steinbeck, and I read his little book, Travels with Charlie, and one passage just stuck out to me. He said, to the restless soul, there is always better than here. Watch for that. There's a lot of restlessness in ministry. So we know that any good thing that comes to us is given, every good gift is from above, but remember, there are some good gifts from below. My brother was a pilot and in the Air Force, and he was stationed in Germany. He decided to live among the folks there, and then while he was there, this man came to him who was the landlord and handed him a bottle, an amber bottle, and he handed it to him, and he said, gift. Man spoke no English. Gift. And there's some of you in here, PhD folks and others that speak German, and you know this is not a good thing. My brother thought, he must have made a little of his own home brew or something, and it's a housewarming gift. And the man realized he didn't know what he was talking about. He said, nine, gift. And the word gift in German is poison. It was rat poison. He was showing him how to sprinkle it around the storage room. And so be careful of some of those gifts that come your way. A good soldier endures hardship, avoids excessive entanglements. Let me just finish with this, because I want to finish on a positive, but Paul does. Notice what he says. Share in suffering as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. No soldier entangles himself in civilian pursuits, since his aim is to please the one who enlisted him. Man, there's no greater motivation in ministry than to please the one who called you into ministry. And I just want to remind you this morning, God is pleased with you. He is crazy about you. He may not always be pleased with what you do, but he's infinitely pleased with who you are. You are his beloved child. I used to put my kids to bed every night, and I would tell them, I love you, and there's nothing that could ever change that. And my son would always lawyer up on me. Well, Dad, what if I robbed a bank? Son, I would still love you. Well, what if when I was robbing a bank, I shot somebody? I would still love you. Now, obviously, there's some ways that we can displease God. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. When we walk in the flesh and not in the spirit, We don't please God. Those who are in the flesh, Romans 8:8, cannot please God. But that doesn't change the way he feels about us. All you parents understand that. And I would say to you, you're being tested now. And I want you to know that's part of this curriculum. God will see to it that your faith will be tested in ministry. And I want to challenge you this morning. I think of those words of A.W. Tozer. It's a long quote. I'll just give you the last line of it. When Tozer says, "It is doubtful whether God can bless a man greatly until he has hurt him deeply. I wish it weren't so, but it's been true in my life. So endure hardship as a good soldier of Jesus Christ, and let's finish this thing." Now, listen, one more thing. I know, because I believe that some of you are struggling to hang in there. And I thought of this as I was driving this morning. I remembered a time when my son was in a race. It was a relay race, and he was probably about 8 years old. And you know that we have twins. We had 3 kids within 2 years, because we had our oldest, and then we had twins. And so we, you know, the nice thing about being a pastor is you don't have a real job, so we could go to their sporting events. So when we get to this sporting event, my wife went with my daughter, and I went with my son was in a relay race. And there were like 8 schools competing against each other. And my son, you know, he got his socks up to his knees back in those days, you know, and you know, he gets ready. He's running the second leg of the relay race. And they're starting the race, and he's looking over at me. Isn't it fun when they're little, you know, they're not too cool yet. And he's going, and I'm going, yeah, someone. And I'm surrounded by mostly women, because the moms were there for their kids, and I was one of the few dads there. And so I'm standing among the ladies, and so they start the race, and I'm praying. I'm praying hard, because here's what you need to understand. My son was born with a hereditary disease that he got from me. It's called slow. And it's true. I was a catcher my whole baseball career, because the first day nobody wanted to be the catcher, and the coach said, "Well, everybody run to the fence and back, and the last guy backs the catcher." So my son is ready to go, and he's running the second leg, and the other problem is it's one of those typical schools where it's not level, it's kind of sloped. And at first I thought that's good, because my son's got the downhill leg. Turns out it wasn't a good idea. So they started at the other end. Our team was way out in front. I mean, we had a good runner in that first leg. And he came, gave my son the baton, and my son took off, and I was amazed. I mean, he was doing great. And then he learned the lesson of adrenaline. He'd never experienced this thing that happens in your body where you think you can do more than you actually can. And then I noticed his body was getting out ahead of his legs. And then then he started windmilling. And then I knew what was coming. I'm going, "Oh, no, Lord, no. Bear him up with eagle's wings and take him to the finish line." And God ignored my pleas. And he hit the ground on his belly, and it was full of dirt. And now listen, I don't know what to do at this moment. Now, you ladies, you're going like, "What do you mean you don't know what to do?" You go, "Comfort the boy." Well, I mean, I don't know as a guy, I'm going like, do I run out there and get him? All I knew was I wanted to get away from the women around me, because they're all looking at me like, "Are you going to do something?" So I just went walking along the side of the track, and I got level with him, and I finally got level with him, and I just kind of bent. I didn't know what to say. And by now he's sitting up, and he's just all dirty, and the baton's over here, and the race is still going on. And I leaned over, and he looked me in the eye, and I didn't know what else to ask. And I said, "Son, can you finish?" Proudest moment of my life as a father. He grabbed that baton, and he wiped his eyes with his dirty hands, and he got up and finished. And our team finished about 5 minutes behind the penultimate team. But I promise you, there was no parent on that premises who was more proud of their child than I was. And I wonder if God's not saying that to somebody here this morning. Can you finish this thing? I know it's hard. But ministry's hard. Father, I just pray for my brothers and sisters here today. I know that ministry's hard, and I know seminary's hard. For some, it's really not what they expected. And for some, it's way more than what they expected. So I pray for each and every one of them here that they would get some time alone and be sober with respect to prayer and eliminate the entanglements so that they can be focused on what you've called them to do. We recognize you are our Father who art in heaven. We adore you. Hallowed be your name. We submit to your authority. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. We're bold in asking that you would give us this day what we need. We confess our debts, the things that we should have done and didn't, and our trespasses, the things that we did and shouldn't have, as we forgive others. And I pray for your protection, Lord, these men and women. Lead them not into temptation. Deliver them from evil. And we will give you all of the glory, for thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. God bless you.